In 2010, in a remote Kazakhstani village called Kalachi, people began collapsing into an unshakable, days-long slumber. Doctors couldn't explain it. Scientists were baffled. Entire families would drop where they stood. Some slept for 2 days, others for a week. When they awoke, they had no memory of what happened. Was it a curse? A secret Soviet experiment gone wrong? An alien signal? Or was the truth stranger than anything we can imagine? Today, we re-diving deep into one of the most haunting modern mysteries in history, the village where everyone fell asleep and wouldn't wake up. And trust me, by the time we reach the end, you may not want to fall asleep tonight. It began quietly. A few cases here, a few cases there. In March 2010, a man named Sergei Ivanov was walking home from the local market. It was a crisp, cloudless day. He remembers reaching into his bag to take out a loaf of bread, and then, nothing. The next thing he knew, he was in a hospital bed, with 3 days missing from his life. At first, people thought Sergei had fainted. Maybe heat stroke. Maybe a stroke. But then, just a week later, it happened again. This time to 2 school children, who were found lying face down on the playground, their friends screaming and shaking them. No matter what anyone did, they simply wouldn't wake up. By the end of that month, 6 more people had been taken by what locals began calling the sleep. It wasn't like normal sleep. When victims were carried to their beds, they didn't stir. When doctors pinched their skin, checked their eyes, even injected stimulants, nothing. And there was something else. When they did finally wake up, they were groggy, confused, and often hallucinating. One woman swore she saw tiny horses galloping across her bedroom floor. A boy said his father's face kept melting like candle wax. Rumors began to spread. Some villagers whispered it was the ghost of the mine that loomed just outside town, an abandoned Soviet-era uranium mine, sealed since the early 1990s. Others swore it was a punishment from God for the sins of the community. But the most unnerving theory of all? That it was contagious, and that anyone could be next. By the summer of 2010, fear had settled over Kalachi like a heavy fog. Parents refused to let their children play outside. Farmers stopped going to the fields alone. Everyone carried an unspoken dread. You could be walking, laughing, talking one moment, and gone the next. But what no one knew was that the first wave was just the beginning, and what came next would make the world pay attention. For nearly 3 years after the first strange collapses in Kalachi, life had returned, or at least seemed to return, to something like normal. Yes, there were the whispers, the occasional side-eyed glance when someone yawned a little too deeply. Yes, people still avoided walking too close to the old mine fence. And yes, the memory of those first victims lingered. But no new cases had emerged for months. In a village like Kalachi, where seasons grind slowly past in silence, it was easy to pretend the nightmare was over. And then came January 2013. It began on a day that should have been full of warmth, laughter, and celebration. Orthodox Christmas in Kalachi was a modest affair. There were no extravagant feasts or towering trees, but homes were swept clean, tables were laid with bread and pickles, and the church bells rang gently in the frost. Children played in the snow, bundled in thick coats, their breath puffing in little clouds. But just before noon, a man named Yuri collapsed in his doorway. His wife, Valentina, thought at first that he'd slipped on ice. But when she bent down, she saw that his eyes were closed, and yet his body was limp in a way that was wrong. Too wrong. She shook him. She slapped his cheeks. She screamed for help. By the time 2 neighbors arrived, Yuri was breathing steadily, but he would not wake. They carried him inside and laid him on the bed. No matter what they did, he did not stir. They had no idea that, only a few streets away, it was already happening again. At the far end of the village, a young man named Timur was cycling home from his uncle's house when his legs suddenly turned to water. The front wheel of his bicycle wobbled, the handlebars slipped from his hands, and he crumpled into the snow without even trying to catch himself. When his aunt found him minutes later, his skin was pale, his breath slow but steady, and his eyes were closed, just like Yuri's. Within an hour, 3 more villagers had gone under. 2 of them were in the middle of conversations when they simply stopped. One fell against a fence, sliding down in eerie silence. The other dropped their spoon into a bowl of soup, the sound of metal on porcelain echoing strangely in the tiny kitchen. By evening, it was clear this was no isolated incident. Kalachi's tiny clinic, just 6 beds, was overflowing. People lay in the hallways, swaddled in blankets, their cheeks flushed with an unnatural warmth. The nurses, working with outdated equipment, could only check their pulses and wait. The village began to quiet. In Kalachi, the streets were never loud to begin with, just the crunch of boots on snow, the barking of a dog, the occasional rumble of a truck. But now there was an unnatural hush. People stayed indoors, locking their doors not against thieves, but against something they could neither see nor name. By nightfall, 20 people were down. 20, in a village of just over 600. That meant everyone knew someone who had fallen. The fear was immediate and primal. Parents huddled with their children in the corners of rooms, afraid that if they went to bed, they might never wake again. Farmers refused to go alone into the fields. What if they collapsed, and no one found them until it was too late? The shopkeeper closed early, drawing the blinds. The streets emptied completely, the village sinking into a darkness broken only by the faint glow of lights behind curtains. It wasn't until the next morning that the news began to spread beyond Kalachi. At first, it was just a murmur. Someone's cousin in Astana heard from a friend, who heard from a nurse. But within a day, a headline appeared in a regional paper. The village that won't wake UP. The phrasing was sensational, almost mocking, but it got attention. Reporters from Almaty came first, armed with notepads, cameras, and skepticism. Surely, they thought, this was an exaggeration, some rural superstition blown out of proportion. And then they walked into the clinic. They found rows of people lying perfectly still, breathing softly, their chests rising and falling in unison like a tide. Some had 4 drips in their arms. Others clutched at blankets as if shivering in a dream. One reporter, a woman from Moscow, later said that what struck her most was the sound. Or rather, the lack of it. No coughing. No groaning. Just the quiet, steady sound of sleep, multiplied by 20. It was, she said, the sound of a village forgetting to wake up. Theories began to spiral almost instantly. Was it contaminated water? Some rare sleeping sickness? Had the uranium mine leaked radiation into the soil? Or was it something darker, a biological experiment, a chemical weapon test gone wrong? Some villagers swore it was a curse. An old woman told a TV crew that Kalachi had been built on unsettled ground, and that the dead were reclaiming their space. Others whispered that this was revenge. For what? They could not agree, but the mine's Soviet past gave plenty of fuel to the imagination. The fear deepened when something happened that no one was prepared for. On the 3rd day, one of the victims, a man named Pavel, woke up. He blinked groggily, sat up slowly, and began to drink water. The nurses were relieved. But just 2 hours later, as he was eating soup, his eyes rolled back and he slumped forward, falling asleep again. This time, he stayed under for another 2 full days. Doctors began to whisper about secondary sleep episodes and neurological involvement. Villagers called it something else, being claimed twice. And then came the after effects. When the victims awoke, they were not the same. Some were simply exhausted, moving with the sluggishness of someone who had not slept in months. Others complained of dizziness, blurred vision, and pounding headaches. And some saw things. A young mother named Anya woke screaming that there were tiny men climbing the walls of her room. A schoolboy insisted he saw the ceiling melting, dripping down in fat, waxy drops. One man refused to drink tea because he claimed the liquid in his cup kept turning to sand. The hallucinations were vivid, detailed, and persistent. Scientists would later note that severe oxygen deprivation to the brain can cause such visions. But to the villagers, it felt like proof that something had gotten inside their minds while they slept. By this point, the government could no longer ignore what was happening. First came the doctors from Petropavlovsk, then from Almaty. They examined patients, drew blood, scanned brains. They found nothing conclusive. Then came the scientists, environmental specialists, geologists, even meteorologists. They tested the air, the water, the snow, and the soil. They collected samples from homes and the old mine. And finally, came the men in unmarked uniforms. They said nothing to the press. They carried cases of instruments whose purposes no one could identify. They worked quietly, deliberately, and without answering questions. When they left, they took with them dozens of sealed containers. No one ever knew what was inside them. Despite the tests, despite the scrutiny, there was no clear answer. And worse, no way to predict when the next wave would strike. Some villagers began sleeping in shifts, determined that someone in the family would always stay awake, just in case. Others tried to leave, staying with relatives in neighboring towns until things calmed down. But Kalachi had entered a new reality, one where the air itself felt like a threat, where each breath could be the one that carried you under. And for those who stayed, the question became less about why this was happening, and more about when it would come for them. By the end of the second wave, Kalachi was a village living with a ghost it couldn't see. Every cough, every yawn, every moment of dizziness became a warning sign. Children were taught to tell their parents immediately if they felt funny in the head. Farmers checked on each other before sunrise. Even the laughter that had once bubbled from the schoolyard seemed thinner, forced. But while most people huddled indoors and prayed it wouldn't happen again, a few began to watch, to count, to notice. The first to piece together the beginnings of a pattern was not a doctor, not a scientist, not a government inspector, but the postman. His name was Victor. He had worked the same mail route for more than 30 years, trudging through snowdrifts in winter, wading through mud in spring. He knew Kalachi's roads like the back of his weathered hands, and he knew its people even better. Victor could tell you who had a bad back, who baked the best bread, whose dog would bark and whose would wag its tail. He didn't need a map to know where everyone lived. Their doors, their windows, their front steps were etched into his mind. Which is why, when he thought about the family struck by the sleep, something began to gnaw at him. Almost every single one of them lived in the same general area, the eastern edge of Kalachi. It was the part of town nearest to a place the villagers rarely spoke about anymore. A place that loomed large on the horizon, especially in winter, when its skeletal buildings stood stark against the snow. Krasnogorsk. In the Soviet years, Krasnogorsk had been more than a mine. It had been a small city in its own right. A hub of industry and secrecy. It had produced uranium or for Moscow's nuclear ambitions. Back then, it was surrounded by guards, fences, and warning signs that promised prison, or worse, to anyone who trespassed. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the mine was abandoned almost overnight. What followed was chaos. Miners left with their families, apartments emptied, and the machinery that once roared day and night fell silent. Soon, scavengers came, stripping metal, ripping out wiring, stealing anything of value. The mine shafts, some plunging deep into the earth, were left unsealed. The locals adapted. Teenagers dared each other to go down into the tunnels with flashlights. Goatherds used the open spaces as shelter in storms. Hunters took shortcuts through the cracked concrete courtyards. Everyone in Kalachi knew the mine's history, but over time, its dangers became more like Old War stories, frightening but distant. Until now, when Victor quietly shared his observation with a neighbor, that all the recent victims lived closest to Krasnogorsk, the idea spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for villagers to start connecting the dots in their own minds. Some remembered the odd metallic taste in the air when the wind blew from the east. Others recalled faint headaches after visiting the outskirts. Soon, all conversations circled back to the same chilling possibility. Was the mine breathing on them? The government, already under scrutiny from the press, decided it could no longer ignore the mine's possible connection. Scientists arrived in convoy, old Soviet buses and newer vans bearing the logos of research institutes. They stepped out into the biting wind in heavy coats, clutching black cases and tripods. The testing began in earnest. First, the obvious, radiation. The Geiger counters clicked softly, their green needles dancing. But the readings were unremarkable. Lower than some major cities, in fact. The soil samples showed nothing extraordinary. The snow was clean. The water from the wells was free of contaminants. Kalachi's hope deflated. If the mine wasn't leaking radiation, then what was happening? That's when a geologist named Andrei decided to go deeper, literally. Andrei wasn't the loudest in the group, but he was thorough. The mine had been on his mind from the start, not because of radiation, but because of its structure. Abandoned mines, he knew, were unpredictable. They shifted with the seasons. They breathed. So one morning, he and two colleagues strapped on helmets and headlamps and descended into one of Krasnogorsk's forgotten shafts. The air changed almost immediately. Outside, it was sharp and cold. Inside, it was stale, heavy, the kind of air that clings to your lungs. Their boots crunched on gravel and broken glass. Water dripped rhythmically from above. In the beam of their lamps, rusted beams jutted from walls like bones. They ventured deeper, past collapsed support frames and pools of stagnant water, until the silence became oppressive. When Andrei paused to take air samples, he didn't expect much. The mine had been open to the elements for decades. Surely, any dangerous gases would have dispersed long ago. But when the results came back, the printout told a different story. The air down there carried elevated levels of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, and a noticeably lower concentration of oxygen. To the untrained ear, it might sound unremarkable, but to Andrei, it was enough to raise every alarm bell in his head. Carbon monoxide, odorless, colorless, doesn't kill with drama. It doesn't choke you or burn your throat. It simply slides into your bloodstream, replacing oxygen in your red blood cells. You grow dizzy, disoriented. You pass out. And if it continues, you die. The levels in the mine weren't high enough to kill instantly, but they were high enough to knock a person unconscious, to mimic deep, coma-like sleep. The realization was chilling. If the mine was leaking pockets of this gas into the surrounding earth, then every shift in wind, every change in air pressure, could push invisible waves of poison into the village. And the tunnels beneath Kalachi weren't mapped anymore. No one knew exactly how far they reached, how many cracks and seams connected the old shafts to the homes above. The theory explained a lot. The sudden collapses. The way victims would sleep for days. Even the hallucinations. Oxygen deprivation can play tricks on the brain. But it didn't explain everything. Why did it sometimes vanish for months? Why did some people recover fully, while others suffered memory loss, dizziness, or strange changes in personality? For that, there were only guesses. Some scientists speculated that the gases pooled differently depending on the season. Others thought certain homes were built directly over old ventilation shafts, acting as chimneys for the invisible poison. One thing was certain: sealing the mine would be a massive, expensive operation, and the government wasn't ready to commit to it. So the villagers went on breathing, sleeping, and fearing, knowing that any day, without warning, the mine might reach up from the darkness and claim them again. And in the spring of 2014, it did, in the most terrifying outbreak yet. By the time spring came in 2014, Kalachi's fear had become part of its rhythm. It was there in the way people paused mid-sentence to gauge whether their friend's sudden yawn was harmless, or a sign. It was there in the way the air was sniffed like milk past its date, as though someone might catch a whiff of the invisible thing that stole their neighbors. But on April 5th, the fear stopped being just a shadow in the room. It became the room. That morning began like any other. The snow had begun to recede, revealing patches of wet earth. A few villagers were preparing for the spring planting, others patching roofs after the hard winter. The first to fall was a boy named Daniel. He'd been walking home from school, tossing a stone up, and catching it in his palm, when he suddenly froze mid-step. The stone slipped from his fingers. He sat down, gently, almost politely, on the edge of the road. And then he toppled sideways into the mud. Two women rushed to him. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow. He would not wake. 30 minutes later, two more people collapsed, this time inside the grocery shop. One slumped forward onto the counter, knocking over a jar of pickled cucumbers. The other simply slid down the wall, his head hitting the shelves on the way down. By the end of the day, 12 people were down. By midnight, 32. Kalachi's clinic was a chaos of stillness. Every bed was taken, the hallways lined with mattresses and blankets. People were carried in by neighbors, their arms dangling, their faces pale. Nurses moved quietly between the bodies, checking pulses and writing times on scraps of paper. There were no treatments to give, nothing to do. The doctors' faces were drawn, their eyes hollow. They weren't saving people, they were waiting with them. By the next morning, the number had climbed past 40. That meant almost 1 in every 15 people in Kalachi was down, unreachable, trapped somewhere in a darkness no one could enter. The streets were empty except for the rumble of old Ladas and Soviet-era ambulances. Even the dogs seemed to sense it. No barking, no chasing, just low, uneasy whines. Some victims woke after 2 days. Others stayed under for 6, 7, even 8. Many woke groggy, asking what day it was, why it was suddenly warmer, why there were new leaves on the trees. But for some, waking wasn't a return. It was a new kind of exile. There was Galina, who forgot the names of her grandchildren. Ivan, whose hand shook so badly he couldn't hold a spoon. And Mikhail, who swore he still saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, weeks after opening his eyes. The villagers had reached their breaking point. That month, dozens packed what little they had and left for good. Trucks loaded with furniture rattled out of Kalachi, past the skeletal remains of Krasnogorsk, never to return. The government began discussing permanent resettlement for the entire village. Some agreed. Others refused to abandon the homes their families had built. The air might be poison, they said, but it was their poison. And so Kalachi didn't vanish overnight, but it changed forever. By the end of 2015, more than half its residents had gone. The streets grew quieter. Windows went dark. The sound of children playing became rare enough to make people stop and listen when it happened. The mine was partially sealed, but never fully. Scientists came and went. Theories were proposed, then disputed. Even now, some in Kalachi believe the truth was never told, that the gas was only part of the story, that something deeper, darker, still sleeps beneath their feet. And maybe they're right. If you've made it this far, you've spent the last hour wandering the silent streets of Kalachi with me, hearing its whispers, feeling the weight of its fear. And here's the thing. Kalachi is not the only place with a story like this. There are other towns with curses that don't make sense. Cities that appear on no maps. Leaders who ruled without ever being seen. And I have them all. So if you re the kind of person who can sleep after hearing a story like this, if you need to know what's lurking in history's shadows, you don't just watch this channel, you join it. Hit subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another village just stopped breathing, and you're going to want to be the first to know why.